All right. So today we're going to talk about regions, which is a term that we've used a lot in class so far, and we've talked a lot about. You'll see a lot of questions that ask you to identify specific regions and something about them. So let's talk about what is a region. Regions are defined as areas of Earth with one or more distinctive characteristics. So this map you'll see is from a few years ago from College Board. Basically, they released a sort of a little primer on kind of regions of the world and how they would group together regions. So you see a lot of geographic reasoning in that, right? A lot of directions like south and east and west and north. But you also see some cultural reasons and some physical reasons having to do with physical geography as to why they would group together places as having similar characteristics. So let's take, for example, North America. You see Canada and the United States grouped together, and the rest of North America, or I guess Central America, grouped together with parts of South America. So there are probably some different reasons for that. For one thing, Canada and the United States have a shared history in terms of British colonization. So you have shared language of English for the most part, except for the Quebecois in Canada that speak French, people from Quebec, as opposed to parts of Latin America and South America where Spanish is the predominant language as a result of Spanish colonization. And you kind of see the dotted line around Brazil. They didn't seem like they knew what to do with Brazil. So they get a little dotted line around them to indicate that they speak Portuguese, probably. Yeah, and you can also see other reasons kind of throughout the rest of the world. So you definitely have distinctive kind of economic indicators as well, such as the divide between Western and Eastern Europe. Western Europe is more developed on average than Eastern Europe. And there's also a lot of shared historical reasons why Western Europe would be grouped together, having to do with communism and the Cold War and the influence of the Soviet Union. So you see kind of political reasons as well. So, yeah, let's see, lots of reasons why we might create regions. So the process of this is called regionalization, which is a tool that geographers use a lot, oftentimes looking for commonalities or similarities across geographic space. And notice the term on the bottom, the cultural landscape. That's the name of your book. It is what happens when all of these elements of culture are superimposed on the physical landscape. So we'll talk a lot about the cultural landscape and what that term means in the next part of this unit. So let's dig in and talk about another aspect of regions. So most of the time when I talk about regions, we're identifying and talking about major world regions. So that map on the first slide is pretty helpful. But there's another aspect of this, and it is learning about the three different types of regions. So there are going to be three different types of regions. I'm going to go through each of them in this order. We have functional, perceptual, and formal regions. So let's start with functional regions, also called nodal regions sometimes, and we'll talk about why. So a functional region is an area organized around a node or focal point. Oftentimes, this is going to be focused in on a similar economic activity that sort of unifies the region. So that's a little bit complicated, but what I mean by that is usually there is a focal point in a business that is associated or a service that's associated with that focal point. And the functional region is the area around it that focal point serves. So for instance, I have a map of Chicago's ultimate pizza delivery area, and you can see the pizza delivery place somewhere in that middle circle, and the delivery region kind of around it. So that would be an example of a functional region. Basically a service that is associated with a specific geographic area creates a functional region. And on the bottom, this map is kind of ridiculous, but it is a map of which NFL game is going to be televised in which market. I always think this is neat, and I've used these to analyze in the past. But basically, they show you specific kind of which specific game is going to be on Fox or CBS that weekend based on kind of the teams themselves. So notice the area in and around Seattle is showing what would probably be a Seahawks game, maybe, I don't know. Maybe not. Who knows? But they're showing a specific game. The Denver area is showing what is probably a Denver Broncos game, right? So that creates what would be, in effect, a functional region around the Denver television market. All right. So next type of region is called a perceptual region. So sometimes you also see the term vernacular region associated with this. A perceptual region is an area that people believe exists as part of their cultural identity. So these are perceptual regions are a little bit tricky in that they are not clearly defined. Oftentimes they are sort of arguable, or you could have some sort of disagreement about what actually creates the region itself. So these are oftentimes you'll see the South used as the example for this. So this is a map from Vox based on how clearly people identify certain states with part of the South. So it's kind of funny. You see kind of the darkest blue is like what we would call the Deep South, or the states that we probably would most associate with the Confederacy. So there's some that it's like kind of tricky to argue. Nobody would argue that Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia is not part of the South. But you kind of get fainter as you go up, right? So you have some people that would include Kentucky as part of the South. Other people, you even see Missouri as like a slight blue. So there's some people that say, well, Missouri is kind of southern, at least in parts of southern Missouri as well. And what's sort of funny to me is, and I've never heard people do this until I got to the West Coast, but you also see some people that put New Mexico and Arizona as part of the South, which geographically speaking, they are, right? They doesn't get that much more south than Arizona and New Mexico. But culturally speaking, we do not frequently include them as part of the South. And similarly, on the left-hand side, the Pacific Northwest, where you'll see kind of somebody's opinion of what would be in the Pacific Northwest. But you could have some arguments about that, right? Some people might include just the western half of Washington and Oregon, saying that the eastern half doesn't have a lot of cultural similarities with the western half, and that would probably be some sort of case for that. So perceptual regions are areas that people believe exist as part of their cultural identity. So they derive from people's informal sense of place. All right. And the last part, I always save these for last because I think this one is kind of tricky. And I always tell kids formal regions are not functional and not perceptual regions, meaning that they're sort of what's left over. And it is kind of this big term that means a couple different things. So formal regions are areas in which everyone shares one or more distinctive characteristics. There's some sort of uniform characteristic that unifies the region. So unlike perceptual regions, no one could argue that this would be considered a formal region, right? So I have the state of Florida on the left-hand side, and you can see two different types of formal regions. For one thing, the state of Florida itself is a formal region. No one can argue what comprises the state of Florida. And within Florida, you have counties, and counties are elements of local government that, again, no one can argue what is a specific county. So they are both examples of formal regions. You could also create formal regions based on similar economic or cultural characteristics in terms of predominance. So, for example, on the right-hand side, we have a corn map. We've looked at a lot of corn maps this week. So you have, I would say, a region that is created of basically states that produce the most corn. And if you're going to include that, you would use this map as part of your characteristics for that, right? You would include Iowa. Iowa would be your focal point probably, but you would include Iowa and Minnesota and Illinois and Nebraska and all of the states that are most predominantly associated with corn production. So one more example. You can also have shared cultural characteristics. So oftentimes in the book, or not in the book necessarily, but in life, you'll hear people talk about the Islamic world is oftentimes a term that's used. And not a perfect term, but oftentimes you'll see a formal region created based on the predominance of people who practice Islam. And it will include Northern Africa and the Middle East and Central Asia. And that will be essentially a formal region that's created based on religious basically percentage of the population who follow Islam, right? So that would be an example of a formal region that is created. Okay.